Welcome everybody. This is our inaugural webinar from Better Brains for Babies. And the topic of this webinar today is on toxic stress. I'm glad so many of you are able to join us, and I hope that you'll find this next hour useful. Before we start, I want to introduce myself and I want to give you a quick orientation to this particular webinar technology. Every webinar system is a little different, so I want to make sure you know kind of the buttons and the tools that you have to work with. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Diane Bales. I am a faculty member in the Department of Human Development and Family Science at the University of Georgia. I am also the co-leader of the Better Brains for Babies initiative, which is a long-standing Georgia initiative to teach people about early brain development. Better Brains for Babies has actually been around since 1998, and we are currently funded by the Georgia Governor's Office for Children and Families, and we thank them and acknowledge them for their support that enables us to do these kinds of programs. Very quickly, let me orient you to the system so that we can get started and actually talk about toxic stress. You should be able to hear me. I'm going to sorry, I'm typing to tell people who cannot hear me that they need to run the audio setup wizard. If you lose audio, you can also always click on the telephone icon at the very top where it says audio and video, and that will give you a call-in number and password. So there is an option if you lose sound somehow. This seems to be a pretty reliable system, but sometimes, occasionally, things happen. I'm going to quickly alert those who are watching chat to that, and then we'll continue. Thanks for your patience with this. We're trying to ensure that we can navigate this system as quickly and smoothly as possible. I wanted to make you aware, the other thing I wanted to make you aware of, obviously there is a text chat box. You are welcome. Your chat should be enabled. You are welcome to type things, to ask questions, to share your ideas, your experiences, and so on in that text chat as the session is going on. If you would like to actually speak, and we certainly welcome speaking as well, there is a button directly below where it says participants. The third button across is a hand raise button. I've been using that as a way of testing your audio to see whether you can hear me. But if you have something that you'd like to say and you have a microphone or a telephone connection connected so you can actually speak, feel free to do that, to press that hand raise button. It'll alert me and I will stop and give you an opportunity to talk. If you don't have a microphone connected and can't talk, you're welcome to use the chat, or if you're more comfortable using chat, you're welcome to do that as well. It's sometimes a little more challenging to make webinars interactive, but I'm hoping we can do as much of that as possible. I actually want to start by having you all complete a pretest. And the way this is going to work, I'm going to click another button which is going to show a different screen, and this is actually going to be an interactive screen once it loads, where you'll be able to answer these pretest questions and press submit. So as soon as you actually see this page loaded in the window, feel free to answer the questions and click submit. This is a quick SurveyMonkey survey to see what you already know about toxic stress. And we'll go back and give you an opportunity to answer these questions again at the end. When you're finished with the poll, if you would click the fourth box under participants is a yes/no box. If you'll click it, it will and choose the yes check mark. That'll enable me to know that you are finished with that quiz. Can everyone actually see the quiz and click buttons within it? We got one yes, one no. So hopefully the no is just a loading time problem. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds more to complete these questions and click submit. Okay, hopefully most of you got a chance to answer those questions. We will go back and review when we complete the session so that we can see what you've learned, and hopefully you've learned some new things about toxic stress. I want to start out by giving you an idea of the objectives. This is a 1-hour overview of the topic of toxic stress and brain development. So in an hour, we're going to cover and take a look at some information about how the brain responds to stress. We're going to talk about the 3 levels of stress, so you should be able to compare and contrast them. We're going to talk about the potential negative effects of long-term toxic stress, and we're going to discuss ways that you can buffer the developing brain from toxic stress. So hopefully this will give you some general information. We are planning some face-to-face trainings and some other opportunities. If this is a topic that really interests you, hopefully this will give you a taste of this topic, and then you will be able to build on that in terms of learning more as we release more materials and more information. I want to start with an example, start with a story. And this is a simple scenario, a case study of a little girl named Grace. She's a 2-year-old. She lives with her mother, her 3 older siblings. Her mom is a single mom and works 2 jobs. She is left in the care of her 8-year-old sister while their mother is at her night job, unless her aunt is available to help out, which is not very often. We also know that Grace's mom doesn't have time to cook and doesn't plan meals. There's usually food available, mostly snack-type foods, sodas, chips, cereal, canned spaghetti, and so on. It's all in the refrigerator or in the cabinets. Grace is not tall enough or strong enough to open the refrigerator or the cabinets, and she needs help getting the food out. And sometimes the other members of her family are too busy to help her do this. So I want you to think about this example as we talk about what happens in the brain when the brain is under stress, and think about some of the kinds of stress Grace is experiencing. For many families who are under stressful circumstances, these are not unusual kinds of experiences. So kind of keep Grace in mind, and we will go back to her in a few minutes. I want to start by framing our discussion by talking about why it's important to study the brain. There are some things we know from recent brain research that show us just how important it is to understand the brain and to understand the effects of stress on the brain, because there are many, many potential effects, and there's a lot adults can do to help buffer the brain from these stresses. We know that the brain, unlike any other part of the body, is not fully developed at birth. So a child's heart is fully developed, a child's lungs are fully developed, assuming a normal birth and assuming a normal, typically developing child. But we know that that is not the case with the brain. At the same time, we know a lot of important foundations of brain development happen during those first few years of life, and those foundations are formed before age 3. And early interactions with nurturing adults are crucial, and sensory experiences are crucial. So there's a lot that we as adults can do to affect brain development. Let me pause here for just a second and ask the person who's on by teleconference, if you could mute your line, because we're hearing some feedback. That way we won't get the feedback on our line. Thanks very much. So before we talk about stress, let's take a look briefly at parts of the brain. Some of you have heard Better Brains for Babies information before, and this will be a review for you. For some of you, this may be new information. There are many different parts of the brain. They all grow and develop at different rates. What's important for our understanding of toxic stress is to understand this area known as the limbic system, which is sort of the area here hopefully you can see this. No, you can't. The area toward the middle of the brain. You see the hippocampus highlighted with a line. The structure right next to it is the amygdala. These two structures are part of a larger system known as the limbic system. The limbic system is the primary unconscious emotional center of the brain. This is the part of the brain where emotions of all kinds are processed first, and particularly where negative emotions are processed. So if something happens that frightens you, if something happens that upsets you, the limbic system picks up that information first. Specifically, the amygdala registers the emotion. The hippocampus works with the amygdala to remember it so that you learn from it. All of this is active in the brain from very early, very shortly after birth, and it's active well before the conscious parts of the brain. So children, even young babies, are processing emotional information in this part of the brain long before they can think about it, long before they can talk about it, long before they can make sense of it. And all of us use our limbic system on a very regular basis. If you have ever been upset about something and have tried to think rationally and think through the problem, when you're in that emotional state, it's very hard to do because the limbic system is where this information is processed first. And so while you're upset, it's very hard to think logically and rationally. It's only after the activation of the limbic system kind of settles down that you're able to take the information and work with it on a much more logical level. And this slide just reinforces what we're talking about as far as the limbic system. It shows the limbic system in the context of the other parts of the brain. And the one that is responsible for the conscious thought is the area labeled at the top, the cerebral cortex. That's the part that controls our language and our thinking and our decision making and all of those higher order executive functioning kinds of skills that enable us to be thinking rational human beings. But remember, the limbic system develops first, and the limbic system is active before these other parts of the brain. And that's important when you think about a child being under stress. If we go back to Grace and think about some of the things Grace is experiencing, her limbic system is likely very active in this situation because she is under several different kinds of stress. Now, the other thing we know about the brain and stress is that the brain is activated. The brain is primed to respond to stress. And again, going back to the previous diagram, it's the limbic system that is ready to respond whenever we experience stress. The example I always use when I talk about the stress response is asking you to imagine being in a near-miss car accident where you don't actually hit something, but you come very, very close, either when you're driving or when you're riding with somebody else. If you have had that experience, could you click the check mark for yes? It's the fourth button under participants. If you have never had that experience, could you click an X for no? I'm seeing some check marks. Give everybody just a quick chance to respond. It looks like 13 of you at least have had that experience. You can click that button again and go back to none to clear your answer. So most of you know what it feels like to have the experience of being in a near miss in your car. And it's a frightening experience when it happens. You see that other car stopping short in front of you, and your brain responds immediately, perhaps even before you recognize consciously that something's happening. Your brain is starting to process, and your brain is starting to make sense of that information. The first thing the brain does is release massive amounts of the stress hormone known as cortisol. The cortisol floods your brain, and it has a very adaptive purpose. Its purpose is to set up your brain to focus entirely on dealing with this immediate stress. So when you're driving along and a car stops short in front of you, you don't need to be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner or how your kids misbehaved or anything like that. You need to be focused immediately on how you're going to get out of this situation, how you're going to stop, how you're going to swerve, whatever it is that you're going to do to deal with the stress. So the brain is flooded with cortisol, which sets up the brain for a stress response. We often refer to this as a fight or flight response because there are a couple of basic things that we human beings tend to do, and even most animals tend to do when they're under extreme stress. They either fight, they fight their way out of whatever's causing the stress, or they flee, they run away, or in some cases the third possibility is they freeze. So they may not physically run away, but they disengage mentally and emotionally so that they're not faced with a stressful situation. So what happens? Your body increases the amount of adrenaline, and so the adrenaline increases your heart rate, increases your blood pressure. You're in this more excited, upset state. And what happens is that enables the brain to focus attention very clearly and specifically on what's causing the stress. And again, it's a good thing. You want to stop that car and not hit the car in front of you. So that focused attention puts all of your reserves and all of your energy just on this stressful situation. And during that time, the more primitive parts of your brain take over. You're not thinking logically. You're not planning out what you're going to do. You're simply reacting. And that's the lower parts of the brain stem and the cerebellum, and also the limbic system that you remember we talked about just a minute ago, that are responding and enabling you to deal with this stress. And it's a good thing. It's an adaptive thing. If we had to plan out, I'm going to take my foot off the gas and put it on the brake, we would hit the car in front of us before we could respond. So the brain is set up to enable us to respond. Now the challenge, though, with children is not all stresses are created alike. There are actually 3 different levels of stress, 3 different kinds of stress, but they are qualitatively different for children. And I love this photo on this slide because you can see in the face of this baby just how much stress she is feeling and she is experiencing. So not all stresses are created equal. The first level of stress that we talk about commonly is actually known as positive stress. I've said this to several people who have said that sounds like an oxymoron. How can stress be positive? And it's named positive stress not because it's fun, not because it's enjoyable, but because the effects of experiencing this kind of stress can be positive. So positive stresses are the quick, short-term, everyday kinds of things that happen that teach us, they're positive because they teach us how to deal with stress. So imagine this little girl who desperately wants a toy that some other child has, and the other child snatches it away and she can't have it. She is extremely upset at this moment that this picture was taken. She is feeling stress, but the stress does not last very long, because how long is an infant going to remember that somebody else has the toy I want? It's typically a pretty short-term kind of stress. It's over quickly, and she learns from it. Next time, if I want this toy, I need to protect it. I need to not sit next to Jimmy, who's going to steal my toy. I need to find something else that I can do if somebody takes my toy. So positive stress enables children to learn how to deal when little things go wrong. There are children who are raised without ever being exposed to much positive stress, and those children have trouble coping as they get older because they have no idea what to do when things go wrong in life. So positive stresses, again, are the little everyday kinds of stresses that we learn from. We get more concerned when children experience longer, more chronic, and more severe levels of stress. And both tolerable stress and toxic stress fall into these categories, where the stresses are more complex, they're more long-term, they're more pervasive. What makes them different? When we talk about tolerable stress, we're talking about possibly things like moving to a new home, the birth of a new sibling, parents divorcing and one parent no longer being in the child's life, those kinds of stresses. So they're big things. They're not solved immediately. The level of stress the child experiences may go on for longer than a few seconds, a few minutes, even a few hours. What makes these stresses tolerable, though, is that the child has support to deal with them. So she's not out there by herself. She's not having to figure out by herself, what do I do in this new home, in this new school, in this new child care environment? She has supporting adults who help her to deal with the stress and manage it. She has safe environments and so on. And we'll talk more about these mitigating factors in a few minutes. Those are the kinds of things that make even sometimes the most severe stresses tolerable. What we worry about most in terms of brain development is this third level that we refer to as toxic stress. Toxic stresses are typically fairly severe, long-term, chronic kinds of stresses, and they happen to children and they happen to developing brains in the absence of support that helps to buffer them or helps to mitigate or lower the stress level. And so a child may be experiencing abuse at home, and it happens on a regular basis. The child never knows, is this the day that my parent is going to hurt me? And the child doesn't have anyone to go to who helps to relieve that stress or any place where she can feel safe. That can quickly become a toxic level of stress. Now, many of you may work with children who are experiencing stress in potentially toxic environments. There are all sorts of them. Abuse, family violence. Many children in families in poverty can have the potential to experience toxic levels of stress because of the stresses of their parents trying to find food and shelter and jobs and keep the family going and those kinds of things. The big distinction, the big thing that's important to remember is the presence or the absence of that kind of support that helps the child to get through it all. So that's what distinguishes more tolerable stresses from more toxic ones. So as we think practically about what adults can do to support children who experience stress, what we can't do necessarily is to eliminate all sources of stress in children's lives. When we talked about positive stress, I explained why that's not even a desirable thing. Children need experiences dealing with small stresses in order to learn how to do it and to build that confidence. So we can't eliminate stress, but what we can do is to provide that support and that buffering for children so that stresses don't become toxic, but instead are more tolerable. And children who are dealing with tolerable stresses have the opportunity to reduce this stress response that we talked about a minute ago for periods of time. That's the other big distinction. A child experiencing toxic stress is under this stress response all the time. Day in and day out, that brain is flooded with cortisol, and the primitive parts of the brain are in control. So the child doesn't have opportunities to practice and strengthen the parts of the brain for communication and logical thinking and decision making because the child is too busy and the brain is too busy dealing with stress. So we want to ensure that children have opportunities to reduce that stress by getting the buffering and the support that they need. Are there any questions or any comments about the 3 levels of stress before we go on? I'm going to pause for just a second and give you all a chance to ask anything that you might want to ask. Again, if you want to speak, feel free to use the hand raise, and I'll give you an opportunity to talk if you have a microphone or a telephone. If you would rather type, I'll give you a second to do that as well. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions or any additions. Could you quickly give me a check mark if you're still able to hear me? I always like to make sure that people are still here and paying attention and engaged. Fantastic. Glad to hear it. All right, well, let's move on. I want to go back briefly to our example of Grace that I shared with you at the very beginning. And before we talk about specific ways to support children under stress and to buffer them, I want to look at some of the kinds of stress that Grace is experiencing. So as we read through this scenario again, I want you to think about the three different levels. Do you see any positive stresses that Grace is experiencing, stresses she might learn from? Do you see any ways that stress is made tolerable by the presence of support to help her get through it? And do you see any places where the levels of stress might possibly become toxic? So again, Grace is a 2-year-old living with her mother and her 3 older siblings. Her mom is a single mom who works 2 jobs. Most of the time, Grace's 8-year-old sister is caring for her while their mom works her night job, although occasionally Grace's aunt is able to come in and take care of her and her siblings. Grace's mom doesn't cook. She doesn't have time. There are no planned meals. There's snack-type food available. It's kept in the refrigerator and the cabinets, and Grace needs help accessing the food. And sometimes the members of her family are too busy to help her out when she's hungry. I'm going to give you a second to type what types of stress do you see in this situation. If you could use the chat box and share any stresses that you see or recognize in this scenario. Okay, I see hunger, lack of routine, no access to food, unable to get her needs met when needed, which can lead to some issues with security and trust. Somebody at the very beginning mentioned no consistent help and support from her family. And fear of security. So you're seeing some toxic and possibly some tolerable levels of stress. And there's a lot we don't know in terms of what's going on in this family. That's always the case with a case study like this. You don't know all of the specifics. Sherry's pointing out she does have food. She may have to wait a bit for help, so it might be more tolerable than toxic. She's not going completely hungry. She just may not be able to have that need met at the moment that it's met. And that's a good way to look at it as well. Some of the things that I identified, I saw possibly a couple of potential positive stressors. You may have to stretch the scenario a little bit to see these as positive. There's some possibility that waiting for food could be a positive stressor. And Elisa points out that not being able to open the cabinet doors might motivate her to practice her motor skills and strengthen those skills. So, so in that sense, that stress might possibly be framed as positive. Being cared for by her aunt, and I made sure to add that as a detail even though it wasn't in the written scenario, because that is a potential place where she may feel some positive stress in that her aunt may have more rules and more expectations than presumably her 8-year-old sister does, but that kind of structure may also be a positive thing in her life. So those are, it took some stretching, but those were some potential positive stressors. Ones that I saw, and you've identified many of these as well, that could potentially be tolerable or even toxic, having a single parent who works 2 jobs. That by itself that is not necessarily a toxic stressor, except that it places the family in the situation where the 8-year-old sister is the one given the responsibility for caring for Grace. And if there are 3 siblings, presumably if the 8-year-old is the oldest, there's probably another child who's either older or younger than Grace that this 8-year-old is also responsible for. So that's a lot of stress to place both on Grace and certainly on her 8-year-old sister as well. The long-term effects of poor nutrition, a couple of you mentioned that, hunger, not having access to enough food, the issue of not having her needs met, particularly in the sense of building self-esteem and of building her trust in the world, which is still a developmental issue even at age 2. So that could be potentially a big stressor. Somebody points out that the 8-year-old may resent being a caregiver and may act inappropriately, may be physical with her. Certainly an 8-year-old does not have the knowledge and the maturity to provide sensitive, consistent care that meets her needs. And placing that responsibility is a lot of stress on the 8-year-old as well. So there are some difficult things going on in this child's life. And the big question is, what kinds of things might Grace need to make these stresses tolerable rather than toxic? Remember, the difference being the presence of support. So if you'll begin thinking about that, feel free to share your answers. I want to quickly talk about why we worry about these toxic levels of stress before we talk about the kinds of things that make it more tolerable. Some of the dangers we know from prolonged stress. These particularly prolonged toxic levels of stress without the additional support. In terms of brain development, at its very most basic, a brain experiencing chronic long-term toxic stress is going to make fewer connections between neurons, and in particular is going to make fewer connections in the parts of the brain that control language and planning and problem solving and all of those abilities that children need in order to succeed in school, to succeed in careers, to succeed in relationships, and so on. So those fewer connections are a big concern. We also tend to see a dominance of survival instincts. What we sometimes call challenging behaviors in children may actually be more signs that the child is under a level of stress that he or she just is not equipped to manage. And so the child is behaving in ways that are adaptive given the stress, but are not socially appropriate for the kind of situation that the child is in. So the child may be persistently hyper-aroused. That's a fairly common thing. May misinterpret an innocent touch or brush as aggression, particularly a child who's experiencing or witnessing violence. May assume that anytime someone moves toward them, that person's going to grab them or hit them or kick them or something, and may lash out, even if it's an accidental touch or an accidental brush or a friendly touch. So the child may have a hair-trigger temper. The child may be impulsive and unable to control his or her temper, control his or her behavior in situations with other people. We also see over time a reduced ability to learn. Again, those fewer connections in those higher order parts of the brain are going to make it more difficult for children to learn. And when children are under enormous amounts of stress, they don't have the mental energy to focus on learning how to read, learning how to do math, learning social studies, those kinds of things. And when children are under stress and don't learn these things, these are all foundational skills on which later skills are built. So if you don't learn your letters and your sounds and so on, you're going to have a hard time learning words, you're going to have a hard time learning to read, you're going to have a hard time learning how to decode an entire page of text. Eventually not being able to read well is going to contribute to difficulties in science and social studies and other areas that depend on reading. So that reduced ability to learn early on can be a really big issue. The other thing that we see for children under, and adults even, under enormous amounts of stress are periods of memory loss. And the memory loss is not necessarily just specific to the stressful situation. Using the example of a child who's being abused in a chronic way, regularly over time. The child may not remember the abuse. Certainly if they're young enough, they may not have a conscious memory of the abuse. But they also may not remember anything else that they learned during this time frame. Because again, the brain is so bathed in the stress hormone cortisol that it's focused on basic survival, and it's not focused on how you learn, how you make sense of your experiences and use them later on. So, and some of these can have some very serious long-term kinds of consequences. Children who don't learn to manage their behavior when they're young are going to have more difficulties getting along with peers and getting along with adults as they become adolescents. It increases their risk for troublemaking behavior, risk-taking, all of those kinds of things. So there are some very real dangers from children being exposed to prolonged stress. In terms of how we as adults support children who are under stress, remember the goal is not to eliminate all sources of stress from the child's life. The important thing is to ensure that the child has support. And one of the most important sources of support for a child under high levels of stress is having a consistent environment. Having a place, having a person, having a set of experiences that are predictable, where you know what's going to happen, you know what you're going to encounter, and just as importantly, you know what's not going to happen. Let's use again the example of a child who is being abused by a parent at home. If that child comes to a high quality early childhood program with well-qualified teachers who are supportive and loving, and a program that follows a consistent routine, during the time that child's there, he can be sure that nothing is going to happen to hurt him in the same way that it's happening at home. So at least during that period of time, he knows what to expect. That reduces his stress for that period of time and makes that potentially very toxic level of stress more tolerable. The other things that are important about consistency. When a child's in a consistent environment, he does the same things over and over again in the same order. That repetition actually helps strengthen connections in the brain. So we're enhancing brain development, we're enhancing the brain's architecture by repeating the same experiences over and over again. Children who know what to expect also are better equipped to manage their own behavior. They are better able to self-regulate, and they feel more confident and more competent because they can do things themselves within the structure of understanding what the consistent environment is. So consistency, providing a consistent environment, providing consistent experiences, providing consistent people is one of the crucial ways that we can help make those potentially toxic levels of stress more manageable and more tolerable for children, and move them from that danger zone of toxic stress into a level of stress that may still be challenging but is more manageable and allows for healthy brain development as well. There are some other key factors that can help to mitigate stress as well. Again, I love the photograph on this slide. If you watch this father and this baby girl interacting, you can see very visually one of the most important ways that we can mitigate stress for young children. And it's through those loving, responsive, and consistent relationships. If you look at this dad and this baby, they are eye to eye. She's smiling, he's smiling. They are enjoying interaction. That's a child who trusts that this person is going to be there to take care of her. And having just one loving, responsive, consistent relationship goes a long way toward buffering the child from even the most toxic stress. Now, we use the words buffer and mitigate. We are not, again, talking about eliminating stress. If you are a teacher or a caregiver working with a child under stress, you can't change that child's home environment. But during the time the child is with you, that child has the opportunity to have that loving relationship that she can count on, and during that time her stress level is able to go down to a more normal level. So that helps to reduce the effects of even the high levels of stress on the brain. Safe environments are crucially important. We talked about this a little bit already when we talked about consistency. Having a place where the child feels safe, where the child knows, while I'm here, nothing bad is going to happen to me. I know what to expect. I know that there are people here who are going to take care of me, who are going to ensure that I'm safe. Again, that goes a long way toward reducing levels of stress, at least for a period of time. So for those of you who may be working in the foster care system, for example, helping those who are caring for foster children to have that environment where they feel safe. And when children come into a new environment, this feeling of safety is not necessarily an immediate thing. They don't know when they first arrive in the environment that it's going to be a safe environment. They've probably come out of an environment where there are some safety issues, where it's chaotic, where they aren't safe. But over time, providing that space, making it clear you're safe here, you're not going to be hurt here, I'm here to help you, I'm here to take care of you. Over time, the child begins to learn that this is a safe place to be. And again, that does not eliminate the stress they have experienced or that they are experiencing, because being separated from a parent is a very stressful situation for children. But it goes a long way toward reducing the levels of stress to much more tolerable levels. We've already talked about development of trust, which comes from both safe environments and loving, responsive, and consistent relationships. I do also want to talk a little bit, though, about experience regulating stress in supportive environments. This goes back to the idea of positive stress and the idea that we cannot protect children from every single possible source of stress that they might ever experience, and even if we could, we don't want to. A 2.5-year-old who desperately wants a cookie 10 minutes before dinner and whose father says, sorry, you can't have it, that 2.5-year-old is experiencing stress during that time. Now, if dad gives in and gives that little boy a cookie, what is that little boy going to learn? First of all, he's going to learn that dad's a sucker, that dad will let me have whatever I want, and he doesn't learn how to deal with disappointment. He learns if I whine enough, if I cry enough, if I get upset enough, somebody will always jump in and help me and rescue me and make sure I have exactly what I want. And adults who do these kinds of things do them with the most loving motivations. We don't rescue children and buffer them from stress because we're trying to not help them grow up well. We're doing it because we can't stand to see them hurt. But over time, we're not doing children a service if we never have them experience the consequences of their behavior or experience these small stresses. And I work in a university setting. I see college students who have lived that kind of life where they have never ever dealt with any kind of stress until they got to college. Because what happens most often is they have a parent who protects them. When they're in first grade and they forget their lunch, mom or dad rushes to school with lunch so the child doesn't have to go hungry. The going hungry one day could possibly be a learning experience. When the child forgets his homework, what happens? A parent goes and brings homework to him. When the child can't figure out how to do the science fair project, what do mom or dad do? They fill in and help the child. In extreme cases, they do the science project for the child. Over time, you can see how this would develop into a child who has never had to deal with disappointment. Now, if that child is in my class and gets a C on an exam, what's likely to happen? That child may still be relying on the parent to come to me and say, why did you give my child a C? Now, the problem is when that child is 20 years old, not only is the child an adult and needs to deal with his own life, but legally I'm not even allowed to talk to parents without the child's permission about the child's grades. So the child has, children need to learn how to deal with these little stresses so that when they get into more difficult situations, going to college, managing their own money, making decisions about relationships and friendships, deciding whether or not to try drugs or alcohol or to drive fast. We can't necessarily expect them to make good decisions in these big situations if they've never had opportunities to deal with the little stresses. So providing support, encouraging children, letting that 2-year-old know, I know you're disappointed you can't have a cookie, but we're not having a cookie right now because dinner is going to be served and I want you to eat your dinner, and if you eat a cookie, you won't be hungry. So helping children to deal with the stress and not always rescuing them is actually one of the really key things that adults can do. That's easier to do when children are dealing primarily with the small positive stresses. It's more challenging if very young children are also in situations where they have toxic levels of stress already. And then there's one other factor that also helps to mitigate the effects of stress, and it's a quality we refer to as resiliency. It is at least partly an internal quality that children have and adults have different amounts of. And we don't know everything about why some children are more resilient than others. What we do know is that having supportive adults, safe environments, trust, experience regulating stress, all of those things help to enable children to build on that bank of resiliency and really be able to manage even through very, very difficult kinds of circumstances. So these are the kinds of things that children under stress need most for healthy brain development. And I want to share a quote here because Dr. Bruce Perry, who is a well-known pediatrician and child trauma researcher, wraps this up very well. We all know children who come out of difficult environments. And what he says is, when you look at children who come out of terrible environments and do well, you find someone in their lives somehow instilled in them the attitude that they aren't helpless, that they aren't powerless, that they can do something. So again, this is helping to build that internal sense of resiliency and helping the children to have that sense of confidence that they can deal with and they can manage their world with the support of adults who help them to get through it. So it's a really, really useful quote. I want to pause here again and get some thoughts from you about things that you do with children, your own children you work with, or things that you teach other people to do that would help to build this sense of resilience and to help to buffer and mitigate this toxic stress. So any examples or things that you think maybe ought to be done? What kinds of things would be helpful? Okay, so role playing, I assume with adults or even with children, helping them to role play some of the situations and how you might deal with them, which makes it less mysterious and less unexpected. What are other thoughts? Routines, absolutely. And the younger the child, the more important having a consistent routine is. And it does not have to be the same routine that everybody else has. We're not trying to set up cookie cutter early childhood programs or cookie cutter families where everybody does exactly the same kinds of things all the time. What's important is that children know predictably what's coming next and that they have that sense of predictability. I see teaching them to voice their feelings, validating their feelings. So what you don't want to do is to tell a child, stop crying. There's no reason to cry. There's no reason to be upset. You know, it's not right to be mad about that. You need to just be happy. Again, often this is said by very well-meaning adults who want children to feel better. But what you're teaching them is, even though I feel these feelings, it's not okay, which does not teach them how to deal with them. So giving them the words to describe their feelings, to name their feelings, and then validating them and letting them know, yes, it looks like you feel angry right now. We all get angry sometimes, and helping them know how to deal with it. Catherine points out letting them know that they're important. Many children who are in stressful circumstances report that they had one person, one place where they knew that they were valued, they were important, and they were loved. And that helped so much to build that confidence. Giving them choices, giving them some control in situations where they may not have a lot of control and a lot of decision-making power, letting them choose what shirt they're going to wear or which of two snacks they want to eat, gives them some of that control back. Encouraging families with high stress levels to find help. And Tammy points out possibly getting children out of the home for part of the day for child care, Head Start, some other kind of a program, so that the parents can have a break and so that the children can be in a different environment as well. Sometimes that's also, that also helps to reduce the parents' level of stress, which in turn reduces the child's. Sherry points out, college-age students, eating well, sleeping well, and breathing well. Absolutely. Enough sleep makes an enormous difference in your stress level. And almost all adults and many children need more sleep than they are typically getting. And that does wonders. I would add to that list, Sherry, being physically active as well. Physical activity burns energy, burns stress, and that being physical helps to reduce stress. Loving, respecting, all of the kinds of things. You all have the right idea of the kinds of things that we can provide for children in these very stressful kinds of situations. I want to show you a list of a couple of resources on toxic stress that may be of some help to you, depending on what you already know and how much you want to know. I don't think the links on the slide are clickable, but I'm going to also type them into the chat box. That's the first one, toxic stress, the facts. The toxic stress, the facts is a fairly basic overview of what toxic stress is. It would be a good thing to share with other people that you work with, possibly with parents, depending on their reading level and their understanding level. Here's the second one, which is excessive stress disrupts the architecture of the developing brain. This is more of a research summary if you want to know a little more in depth about what's happening to the brain when it's under stress. And then this third one is actually a briefing report that was written at the University of Wisconsin for a family impact seminar that they hold with legislators, trying to help legislators understand the effects of toxic stress on learning and on children's health. Because as we talked about, if children are under extreme stress, they're not ready to learn. They're not going to do well early, and they can have health consequences both immediately and in the long term. So it's written more from a policy perspective, but it may be useful as well. And feel free to share these links and these resources with other people who were not able to attend today. They may be resources that they find interesting as well. I want to wrap up here with one more quote, because it reminds all of us how important what we do to support young children and their families and their caregivers. Society cannot continue to ignore the laws of biology. The more we learn about early brain development, the more responsibility we have to act on that knowledge. Bruce Perry again, the child trauma researcher. When we know what we can do to reduce toxic stress, to protect and buffer the developing brain, we have a responsibility to do it, whether it's directly with children, whether it is indirectly in the people that you're educating who then work with children. So that's kind of the motivational speech for to kind of wrap up our session. I'm going to stop the recording at this point, and then I've got a couple of wrap-up comments and conclude a post-test for you to do, and also some other information.